Well, good morning. Um, I am glad to be here. I am not trained as a linguist, um, but I am really impressed with the wide range of knowledge and skills and experience that you all have. I've been impressed with the complexity of the whole issue of orthographies. Um, Having lived and worked in a few different language areas, it's just astounding and such a complex thing. So I am really glad for the skills that you bring to this. I am looking forward to what each one of you shares over the next few days. I enjoyed what I heard yesterday. Um, there are so many languages, so many different ways we could possibly represent what people say. Um, and the same thing happens with the way that we think. So many different ways that people think. How do we understand it? Um, I can reassure you that I will not be talking about any of the technical areas of orthography. That definitely is not my skill set. Instead, I'm going to be talking about something that any of us who work with other humans end up encountering, and that is, how do we work with people? How do we figure out what's going on inside their heads, inside their hearts? How can we live and work well with them? So you've already heard, thank you, Karen, for my, secondhand confession. Uh, I am not a linguist, and in actuality, I did not start off as an anthropologist. Anthropology is something that both Meg and I became interested in because we found out we were not understanding the people that we were with. We both have master's degrees in different areas of agriculture. And when we finished our master's degrees, we went with a small organization to the southern Philippines to work with the Dulangan Manobo people. You can call them Manobo for short. Um, and we really enjoyed our time there. We were asked to help them learn new ways of farming. Now, why would you want to introduce something new? They had a traditional agricultural system that had worked very well. It is what people often call slash and burn. I prefer to call it shifting cultivation. And it actually is a good system. The way it works is a farmer, it works where there is a lot of land and a lot of forest and not many people. And a farmer cuts down an area of forest, lets it dry out, he burns it, plants his crops, and they flourish. After a year or two, there are too many weeds for the crops to compete with because they don't have plows, frequently they don't even have hoes, very low technology, and they move on to another area of forest and let the first bit grow up. And they can let it grow for, I've known of one case where it was allowed to regrow for over 50 years. It's a kind of farming that works well when you have a lot of land. But when settlers come in from the outside, it's no longer practical. And that is what happened after World War II. People from elsewhere in the Philippines flooded into this area, and the Manobo now farm on probably 2% of the land that they used in 1950. So they were interested in learning new things, and we were a bridge to that new knowledge. But when we started there, we realized we had a lot of bright ideas, but they were the people who really knew what ought to be done, and we were just a bridge. One of the things they were interested in was gardening. They used to be able to gather all of the wild weeds, the greens, from their cropland, but now they were having to go a long way to get to their farms. It was an hour, 2 hours walk sometimes. They didn't have vegetables, and so the women wanted to grow them. And Meg and two of our co-workers who were with the Translators Association of the Philippines taught the women how to grow gardens. They began by going around with the women and saying, well, where is a good place that we can have a demonstration garden, that everybody can learn in together? And the Manobo women identified one place, and I don't remember which of the three it was who asked, but the question was, whose land is this? And the answer was ours. That's inclusive we, not you. So it was obviously a very high group kind of people. They help each other a lot. The agreement was that the women would come every week. They first prepared the land, planted the seeds, and then they were to come every week and weed. And then when they came to weed, if there was anything to harvest, well, they would harvest that and divide it among themselves. So the first maybe 2, maybe 3 weeks, the women came on the appointed day, and the next time there was one woman who came. And the week after that, there was one woman who came. And then the crops started to get to the point that you might be able to harvest them, and when she came to weed, they were all picked. Things were not working the way they were supposed to. They weren't working the way that we were told they had to be designed when you're in development work. Everything has to be owned and operated by the community, but it wasn't working. Another thing the Manobo wanted to learn was how to grow irrigated rice. Now their ancestors had grown rice, nobody knew how long, but it was always rain-fed rice, mountain rice. And they had seen irrigated rice in the lowlands when occasionally somebody went out, they knew it grew well. How do we do this? And they wanted to learn. And people from one village said, would you help us get started in this? So they identified an area of land that it would be a group farm, and everybody came, prepared the land, you plant, and then they were going to come as soon as the rice got up to a certain stage, they would come every week and weed, and then when it was harvest time, everybody shared in the harvest. It turned out that there was only one man who came to weed. But when it was harvest time, everybody came and got a share. Group things didn't work. And we'd been told they had to be group things. The community needs to own this thing for it to work. We wanted to work in the culture. We observed, we saw things fail, and we didn't know why. And that's what got us interested in anthropology. We realized it wasn't enough to just observe. It wasn't enough to just want to do the right thing. We didn't understand. We got interested in anthropology because we wanted to help people develop. And that, by the way, that's in all areas, not just economics. But we needed some tools that could help us do what we really wanted to do. And that's the emphasis that I've had as an anthropologist with coworkers who are linguists, who are literacy folk. And it's the same thing when I'm working with people who are in agriculture. The object is not to become an anthropologist. The object is to understand the people that we work with so that we can work well and live well. And so I just want to share a few of the tools that we gained from anthropology, which I hope will be helpful to you all too. So I want to begin with just looking at people. Now, most of you here are working in some capacity with a language community. But that word community is kind of a sticky point because it is a word that can be very misleading. And the problem is that communities are made up of people, and not everybody in the community is the same. So this is after church one Sunday in the village where we lived. You can see all kinds of people there. Middle-aged men, middle-aged women, young men, young women, boys, girls. And the problem is that these different kinds of people can have different interests. One of the issues is who knows the language of wider communication. With the Bonobo, early on when we were first there, only a few of the men went outside the community down into the main civilization and had contact with outside people groups. Very, very few of the women had been outside of the language area. So it was the men, and only some of them, who knew the regional language. That has changed, but it's a feature. Education is another thing that we run into. I was interested with some of the poster sessions yesterday and how the orthography has been changing over time. And one of the issues is how well educated people are. Do they want an orthography that works really well with their language and it doesn't matter if it looks like the orthography that is being used elsewhere in the country? Or do they want something that looks like what they know is used outside? And what's their attitude toward that wider culture? Do they want to be part of it, or do they want to declare themselves separate? And they can do that with an orthography. Are there geographical differences within the group? Now, I'll use some colloquial American English here. Mountain people are hillbillies. People down on the plains are the flatlanders, and then I guess those in the in-between are the midlanders. And we found that this was the case with the language group next to the one that we worked with. They talked about the mountain people, the flat people, and the people in between. And they had different interests because the people down in the flatlands had people from other language groups all around them. And the people up in the mountains were all by themselves. And they had a different attitude toward their own language. How do we find out about the differences? Well, one of the first things is just observe. And we found it to be a real privilege and advantage to be able to live right with the people that we were working with. We were there over a 19-year period. We had been there 3 years in one place. When we went back, the Bonobo people wanted us to live in the middle of the village, and they found a place that was on what I'll call Main Street. It was one of the three main footpaths leading through the village. But we lived there. We went back with our firstborn, who was a year old, and we're smack in the middle of the community, and we got to see everything. Some of you don't have that privilege, but as much as you can, get out there and observe. But it's not enough to just observe. Ask people too. Ask them about, what the different kinds of people are. And you can start by saying, in my community, here are some of the differences we pay attention to. What's important to you? We talk about people if have they graduated from college? Well, that didn't mean anything to the Bonobo people. Schooling didn't matter. Have they planted their first field all on their own? And You find that out by talking with people. Ask for the names of the different villages. Ask for the names of the different regions. Ask what makes one place different from another. And in doing so, you're finding out about the factors that are important to them. You are also inviting them to start thinking about their people and to start seeing some of the needs and differences in needs among their own people. So my hope is that this period of time that we've got this morning is going to be one that you are finding some answers. And so I've got some questions that I'd like you to talk about in your own table groups. And you can see them there. In the eyes of the language group that you happen to be working with, in their eyes, what would they say are the different kinds of people? Now, for the Manobo, they would just say, Ma'ama, Bayi, Bata, man, woman, child. Oh, Kanobon, Malaod, there's a young unmarried woman, young unmarried man. And after that, oh, Dato, there are a few leaders, but they didn't have teachers. They didn't have, I mean, everybody was a farmer. Everybody did the same thing. If you ask in our home church back in North Carolina in the US, well, we had lots of answers about what kinds of people they are. But the next thing is, what does each kind of person really care about? What's important to them? What does the community as a whole want? And sometimes, maybe that's a question you can't even ask because the divisions within the community are so great there isn't a united desire. And then what about outside the community? Who else is involved? For the Manobo, it was the neighboring group, the Tadorai, and then Bisaya, that is settlers. What do those people want? And they would tell you, well, there are different kinds of Bisaya, and some of them want this and some of them want that. And then a really hard question is, in your work and what you are doing, whose voices need to be heard and whose voices need to be paid attention to? That is, who is this for? Yes, you might need to listen to the Ministry of Education. Who is the orthography for? And so, let me give you 10 minutes. And please have somebody in your group write down anything significant that you come up with. Each table is going to have 2 minutes at the very end of this time to share. So you're going to have to keep it for. Now, what you've been doing is talking about the different kinds of people that are involved in your language community and in your work with them. So you've actually been thinking about this next thing already, and that is about the relationships between these groups. So I'd like to focus just a bit more on some of the ways that we can use to become aware of the interests, the concerns of each part of the community and each party that is involved. And also thinking about how our awareness of those concerns can help to identify possibilities for cooperation and also warn us about the possibility of opposition. So it really focuses on people and particularly on the relationships between them, and then on what is going on inside that produces that behavior of how we relate to each other. And that means we have to look under the surface. Now, a key part of what drives our behavior is what is important to us, what we're concerned about, and what resources we feel that we have, what resources we feel we need to protect. How does that affect the way that people within a community think about their language and make decisions about their language? Well, I've already mentioned the issue of whether people are monolingual and stay within their language group, or whether they travel outside or are in a mixed community and are frequently interacting in a multilingual way. I've seen some of your presentations where it looks like part of the issue is how long people have been reading. An orthography that may be particularly well suited to a new reader may become cumbersome, have too much information for a seasoned reader, and they want things to be represented differently. So education and length of time that they have been literate is an issue. Religion can be an issue. Many religions have a particular language and script that is tied to their sacred scriptures, and they may wish to use that. People who are not part of that religion, if they maybe the same language, maybe a different language, they may want a script that distinguishes them as being different. And actually, that can even happen within people groups where almost everyone uses the same religion, but they have different interests, where some have a traditional script that they wish to retain because it works well with their sounds, and others want to use a script that is that in the traditional language scriptures. You can probably think of other issues, and that's really the whole thing that I would encourage and that anthropology encourages. Look at the people that you're with. So if it's nice to have the principles down, it's also nice to have a process or a procedure. What I would suggest, don't do this on your own. Do it working with the people that you are working with. I'm assuming now that you've been talking with them, that you have been talking, they have been deciding about um, significantly different groups of people within the language community and outside of it as well. For each of those kinds of people, for each category, um, write, use some paper, cards, whatever it is, write down what that particular group is concerned about, what their interests are. As you're talking about this, be asking about why they want that. With the Manobo people that we were with, they have 6 vowels. The dominant language in the area has 3 vowels. Now they write them with all 5 Roman vowels. But O, well, O is that they'll write an O, but it's pronounced oo. They'll write a U, and it's oo. The character E is pronounced as A, regardless of, whereas with the Manobo, it can mean 2 different things. Well, actually, no, they don't have the E. Everything becomes an E. So an E is an E, and an I is an E. And then ah, well, ah is always ah. But some of the Manobo people who learned to read when they were monolingual, they really liked the orthography that has 6 different vowel characters. Those who are used to, who learn to read and write first in the outside language, You cannot tell what the word is when they write it, but they're fine with that. Um, so why do they want to do that? Well, because it's what they're used to in school. Well, write it down. It's a good reason. And if you are identifying why people want to do this, then there's the opportunity for discussion about whether they really want to do that or not. And then, second thing, have them sort the cards into piles of groups that have similar interests and groups that have different interests. And what you're looking at here is potential allies and potential sources of opposition. Now, I'm not suggesting that you're identifying the helpers and the enemies. What I'm suggesting is that you and the people you're working with are starting to see where the real tensions are and where the real points of connection are in the situation that you're interested in. And the reason to do this is that as you work with them, they will start to be thinking about opportunities for cooperation in achieving what they want, and also becoming aware of potential sources of opposition. Now, it's often helpful to have a more structured process. This is sort of open-ended, loosey-goosey. It's the general principles, some tools that can help you be more precise are stakeholder analysis and identifying different stakeholders, then looking at their importance, that is, their interest in helping the group's goals succeed, and then their influence, how much power they have, and seeing how those go together, how they differ. It helps to identify what groups the community should be approaching and what groups they need to be aware of. And then force field analysis is simply a way of looking at opportunities and opposition. And one of the advantages is frequently the thing that comes to mind when we have a problem is how can we get rid of it? How can we overcome it? But it might be easier to go around the big hole in the road than to fill it in. And that's what force field analysis is good for. We are not going to go over those right now. There are links to some resources that can help you learn about those and use them in the file for this presentation. But without those tools, I want to come back and give you another time to talk together. Referring back to the groups that you identified in your first discussion, referring to them, how would you sort them? That is, which ones have similar goals, which ones have different goals or interests? And then based on how you sort them, what opportunities do you see for possible cooperation? What potential opposition do you see? And then a big question is, are there ways to work around that opposition, to go around it rather than trying to overcome it? And finally, is there some way that an opponent might be converted into an ally? If you understand an interest that they have, that might be an open door. So again, let me give you 10 minutes. Please, somebody write down what you're coming up with, because we are going to share it at the end. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I do want to move on to one other final topic, and that is to what I'll call the rules of the game. How many of you play what British people call football? Does anybody play what those from the US call football? Or did you? um, how well does it work to use the rules from one game when you're playing the other ones? And that's the issue that I think Meg and I discovered in working with the Monobo people. We had in our mind, this is how people work together. And that wasn't the way the Monobo worked together. You know, people are complicated. Um, if you think about something like chemistry, you know, mixing together a certain acid and a certain base or alkali, it's pretty predictable what is going to happen. And theories in chemistry, typically, if you cannot explain at least 98% of what is happening, it is a bad theory. Meg's training is partly in microbiology, and what I found out is that when you have a theory that is explaining what is happening with microbes, if it explains 65% of what you're seeing, it's a good theory. How much would a theory of culture have to explain to be a good theory? Which is to say that any theory of culture is only going to explain part of what you see. If it explains 30% of what you see, I'd say it's pretty good. But that's a lot better than understanding 2% of what you see. And we eventually, in anthropology, encountered several theories that helped us to understand what we were seeing. One of them that I have found particularly helpful was invented by an anthropologist named Mary Douglas a few years after I was born. And she noticed that there were two factors that explain a significant amount of what you see go on between people. And she called those grid and group. Now, group is, I think, the easier of the two to understand. This has to do with how much an individual considers himself an independent actor or has to take the group into account in his decisions. Now, we're not talking about how emotionally close or emotionally intimate we are with other people. What we're talking about is whether we feel free to make our own decisions. Now, in a high group society, people take their group into account when they make decisions. One example of this is when our eldest son had become engaged, and he had made a deliberate effort to make sure that we were in Malaysia at the time when it was quite obvious the first December that he came to visit us in Malaysia. He'd been talking with some particular woman back at college, and he had this kind of dreamy look in his eyes. We could tell he was struck, and in fact, it stuck. That woman is his wife. And the next summer, when we were in the US, they went out of their way to come and be with us for a week, and we got to know her and enjoyed her and thought she was a great match for him. And then the following Christmas, they both came to visit us in Malaysia. And our closest neighbor in Malaysia was a young couple from India. And Meg happened to mention to the wife that our son was coming and bringing his fiance, and we were really looking to getting to know her better. And our neighbor said, "How did you ever find a wife for him?"
I think Meg's answer might have been along the lines of, well, we have relatives in the US that we could entrust that to. And the relative we had in mind was our son. But it brought out who's supposed to be finding your mate? And our neighbor, it was her parents and her husband's parents who thought they might be a good match. And what do you think of it? And they said, okay. Now, it's different. In their society, marriage is a group thing. It involves many people. And in American society, people, the usual thought is that's their decision. Now, the other flip side of this is that not only do you have to take the group into account, but you can also rely on them. And they'll be with you when you have trouble. But that's group. Now, grid. Why did she say grid? I would say it's because she was a preacher's daughter, and you know the way sermons work, it's nice if the words rhyme, and if you can't make them rhyme, then you have them start the same way. So grid and group. Grid is just about social distinctions. If a society has a lot of social distinctions, then there are differences in how important those kinds of people are. And some people have to do some things and may do some things, and other people have to do different things and may do different things. And since there are a lot of social distinctions, there are a lot of rules, and this is right. Um, at Payap University, I am required to dress a certain way, and our language tutor warned me, when you are not at the university, you still need to dress decently. Because your students might see you and might be embarrassed. I don't know. You guys can tell me if you'd be embarrassed to see me in flip-flops, but that's grid. And these go together. What grid does is it produces a whole bunch of boxes in the society. And I'm reminded of my grandparents had a desk like this. We call it a pigeonhole desk. And each little pigeonhole was for a certain thing. And you knew the rules of what went where. In a hybrid society, it can be more like the mail room in a big company. There are rules for what goes where. So each kind of person knows how he's supposed to dress, how he's supposed to act, what is required of him. And these go together. Whoops. So you've got high grid and low grid, high group and low group. 2 times 2 equals 4, so 4 kinds of society. And what we're talking about here is these societies, each one of them has different rules of the game for how people make decisions. And that's what our work with communities is frequently about. Those decisions that somebody is going to make. Who makes the decisions? How do they make them? Now, low grid and low group, that means not much social distinction. Nobody's more important than anybody else. And each person acts on his own. How does the group make decisions? Well, each person makes his own decision. And this was the problem that we had with the Monobo. They looked like they were a very high group kind of people. And it turned out that they're actually, when it comes to decisions, they're actually very low group. We would even ask sometimes walking by a coffee field, whose coffee is this? And what I was expecting, from the way I grew up, is, oh, that belongs to Bob and Susan, or, some other couple. Well, it might belong to Susan and not to Bob at all. Very individual. Mary Douglas called a society that has a lot of group but still low grid egalitarian. And what this means, again, people are more or less the same. No real difference in how much power people have, how much influence they have. Difference in respect, but not in power. But they make decisions as a group. How do they make decisions? They talk about it, and talk about it, and keep talking about it until everyone is genuinely agreed. And it takes forever, but everybody's happy. What happens if you throw in grid, if you've got power distance? Well, but you've still got high group. What you have is a layering of groups. Some of you may come from churches that had a lot of committees. Some of you don't. But in a church with a lot of committees, this committee makes decisions, and then they pass it down to the church, and the church does what they decided. In societies, you may have one particular group of people who make decisions together. Let's say it's the village elders, and then there may be other committees or other layers of society that are charged with carrying out that particular decision. But it depends on what kind of decision it is. So you've got different committees or different parts of society that do different tasks. And you've got things being decided as a group at a particular level, but you've got different levels of society. You can have the same power distance, but then the groups break down. And instead of you being part of a group, you are individually responsible to the person above you. And this is what's typical, I am told, of the US military. I have never been in the US Armed Forces. My father was for a brief time. And if the sergeant tells you to do something and you haven't done it, you had better not say, well, my buddy said, I told you. And that's the authoritarian society, top down. So how do we make decisions? Frequently, it's thought of as sort of a spectrum going from one person making the decision to consensus. But what I would suggest is that that spectrum leaves out some societies, and they may be the ones that we're working with. So my question to you is, how about the people that you are working with? How do they make decisions? How are you going to figure out who the literacy teachers should be? How do you figure out who should be helping with the translation? How do you figure out how do you figure out how to figure out the orthography? And then in some of these societies that do have a lot of grid, a lot of power distance, how are you going to hear from everybody including those who don't have a lot of education, and come up with an orthography that meets the needs of everybody that it should be meeting the needs of. So here are some questions to ask, to talk about among yourselves. What kinds of people tend to speak the most? And what kinds of people tend to say the least? Okay, that's kind of bringing out the grid issue. Are there people who don't feel like they have the right to speak? And then how strong is group? Are people eager to agree with the group? Or do you see that there's a significant time that people want their voice to be heard, and they will speak up even if it isn't exactly what everybody else has said? Who usually makes decisions? Is it the elders? Is it one person? Is it everybody? Are there categories of people that are unlikely to be heard from? And then the real question is, how are you going to go about this matter of deciding about the orthography or other issues that you're dealing with? What process is actually going to result in hearing from everybody that ought to be heard from? 15 minutes, and then we are going to run into the end of this. So 10 minutes, and then if you've got something significant to share, we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So 10 minutes.